The ferry's engine groaned, a mournful bass note swallowed by the churning gray of the channel. Dean stood at the rail, the salt spray a sharp sting against his face, a sensation he welcomed. It was a physical reminder of where he was, a tether to a reality that had, for too long, felt porous and indistinct. The island, a jagged silhouette against the bruised sky, grew steadily larger, a promise of utter isolation. He needed it. Needed the silence, the vast, empty expanse to finally, truly mourn. The solicitor's letter, crisp and formal, had arrived like a misplaced tide, pulling him from the stagnant waters of his grief. An inheritance, a lighthouse keeper's cottage on a remote island, bequeathed by a grandfather Dean had never known, a man who'd vanished from family lore decades ago. It felt less like an inheritance and more like an exile, a final, fitting destination for a cartographer who had lost his bearings. The dock was a precarious assembly of weathered timbers, slick with brine and algae. A single figure, stout and silent, waited beside a battered utility vehicle. The driver offered a curt nod, no words exchanged, simply a gesture towards the vehicle's open door. Dean climbed in, his duffel bag heavy on his lap, the silence of the journey punctuated only by the rumble of the engine and the incessant, sibilant whisper of the wind whipping across the island. The road was little more than a track, winding upwards, away from the small, desolate fishing village clustered around the harbor. Fog, a dense, milky curtain, began to descend, swallowing the already muted landscape. It pressed in, blurring the edges of the world until only the immediate path ahead remained. Dean felt a peculiar sense of relief. The fog was a shroud, a natural barrier against the world he had left behind. The cottage materialized out of the mist, a squat stone structure clinging stubbornly to the cliff edge. The lighthouse, a stark white sentinel, loomed above it, its lamp unlit, a blind eye staring out into the vast emptiness. The driver stopped the vehicle, pointed a thick finger towards the cottage door, and without another word, turned the vehicle around, disappearing back into the swirling gray. Dean was alone. The door groaned open, revealing a cavernous gloom. He moved through the rooms, a slow, methodical survey. The furniture, draped in white sheets, was skeletal, ghostly. Dust motes danced in the anemic light filtering through grimy windows. Upstairs, a single bedroom overlooked the churning expanse of the sea. The bed was bare, the mattress yellowed and sunken. He unpacked his bag, laying out a few changes of clothes, a well-worn copy of Moby Dick, and his own cartography tools, compass, dividers, a roll of blank vellum. He found a small, rusted kettle and filled it from the hand pump in the kitchen, lighting the ancient gas burner with a trembling match. The hiss of the flame and the eventual whistle of the kettle were the only sounds for a long time, until he heard it. A soft, rhythmic thump, 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 barely audible beneath the wind's howl. He froze, mug of lukewarm tea halfway to his lips. It wasn't the wind, nor the house settling. It was too regular, too deliberate. It seemed to come from below, or perhaps from the very ground beneath the cottage. He listened, straining. The sound ceased as abruptly as it began, leaving only the relentless roar of the ocean against the cliffs. He told himself it was the house, the old timbers, the wind playing tricks. His grief had made him jumpy, his mind eager to conjure ghosts where none existed. He spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the immediate vicinity of the cottage. The ground was uneven, overgrown with tough, salt-stunted grasses. The wind was a constant physical presence, tearing at his clothes, tugging at his hair. He walked towards the cliff edge, keeping a safe distance, watching the waves crash against the black rocks below. The sea was a restless, hungry thing, its vastness both terrifying and comforting in its indifference. As he circled back towards the cottage, he noticed a subtle depression in the earth, half hidden by a thicket of gnarled bushes. It was too regular to be natural, a rectangular indentation in the ground, almost like a scar. It was secured by a massive padlock, green with verdigris, its shackle thick as his thumb. The hinges were fused with rust, but the hatch itself felt impossibly solid, anchored deep. An underground bunker. The air here was different, heavier, laden with the smell of damp earth and something else, something faint and unsettling, like ozone after a storm or stagnant water from a hidden spring. Nothing. Only the distant shriek of gulls and the relentless churn of the sea. It was a place designed to keep things in, or perhaps to keep things out. A shiver traced its way down his spine, unrelated to the wind. This wasn't just a cottage. It was a post, a guard station. His grandfather, the reclusive keeper, had left him more than just a roof over his head. He had left him a mystery, buried beneath the earth. He stood up, wiping the grime from his gloves. The fog had thickened further, pressing in on the cottage, swallowing the lighthouse, obscuring the sea. He felt suddenly exposed, utterly alone, with the heavy, silent presence of the bunker just steps away. He went back inside, locking the cottage door with a definitive click. He had arrived at the edge of something ancient, something that had been waiting. It was a physical reminder of where he was, a tether to a reality that had, for too long, felt porous and in constant flux. He had found the cottage much as his grandfather had left it, a time capsule of dust and salt-laced air, filled with the scent of old wood and something vaguely mineral. The first few days passed in a blur of unpacking boxes, sweeping away generations of forgotten grime, and simply existing in the profound silence that only such a remote place could offer. Yet a subtle disquiet began to seep in, like the persistent dampness of the island itself. It started with the tides. As a man who understood the meticulous order of the world, Dean had always found comfort in predictable patterns. The ocean, despite its vastness, obeyed immutable laws. But here, the water behaved with an unsettling caprice. The high tide, he noticed, crept further up the shingle beach each night, inching past the familiar watermark, leaving a dark, slick line dangerously close to the cottage's foundation. Then, just as inexplicably, it would recede to an impossible distance, exposing a stretch of seabed he hadn't seen before, pocked with strange, iridescent pools and alien-looking flora that seemed to pulsate faintly in the dim light. He consulted his grandfather's old tide charts, meticulously drawn and annotated, but they offered no explanation. The numbers simply didn't align. He tried to rationalize it. Unusual weather patterns, a strong lunar pull he'd overlooked, perhaps even the island's unique geology. But the feeling of wrongness persisted, a low thrum beneath his skin. At first, he dismissed them as the wind, a trick of the sea breeze whistling through the cracks in the cottage's weathered timbers. The island was a symphony of natural sounds, the mournful cry of gulls, the relentless roar of the surf, the rustle of sparse, salt-blasted vegetation. But these sounds were different. They were low, guttural, carried on the wind like snatches of an ancient language he couldn't quite grasp. They seemed to coil around the cottage, slipping through the gaps in the window frames, brushing against his ears when he stood by the open door. He would pause, straining to hear, convinced he was on the verge of deciphering a word, a phrase. But they would always dissipate, leaving only the familiar howl of the wind, making him question his own perception. Was the isolation finally getting to him? Was the grief still a raw, gaping wound, playing tricks on his mind? He gripped the worn spine of a book, forcing his attention back to the printed words, determined to anchor himself in something tangible. One afternoon, while attempting to clear out a particularly damp and neglected section of the property, a low-slung, stone-reinforced structure half buried into the hillside, which his grandfather had always simply called the storage vault. Dean discovered a heavy, rusted metal hatch. He retrieved a powerful lantern from the cottage, its beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating a small, cramped space below. It was an underground bunker, surprisingly dry despite its subterranean location, and filled with an assortment of his grandfather's forgotten tools, old fishing gear, and stacked crates. Tucked away on a makeshift shelf beneath a tarpaulin heavy with sea salt, he found it. A journal. He carefully unfastened it, the hinges groaning in protest. The pages within were brittle, some fused together, others rippled and discolored. The ink, however, had largely held fast, though it had bled in places, creating unsettling smudges. He began to read, his brow furrowing with each cryptic entry. His grandfather's usually precise hand was erratic, the letters sometimes sprawling, sometimes cramped, as if written in haste or distress. The early entries were mundane, detailing weather patterns and lighthouse maintenance. But as he delved deeper, the tone shifted, growing increasingly paranoid, riddled with fragmented observations about the ocean. "The pull is stronger," one entry read, the words nearly illegible. "It calls." Then came the sketches. Rough, frenzied drawings filled the margins and entire pages. They weren't of ships or the island's wildlife, but of abstract, undulating forms. Tentacles, perhaps, but not quite. More like root systems, or veins, or vast interconnected organs, all writhing beneath the surface of the water. One particular drawing made him flinch. A swirling vortex of dark water, from which indistinct, elongated shapes seemed to reach, accompanied by a single scrawled phrase: "The deep song." Dean's breath hitched. The deep song. He flipped through more pages, finding increasingly desperate warnings. "It hears," one passage declared, underlined multiple times. "It remembers the pact." His grandfather, a man he remembered as stoic and grounded, had clearly descended into some kind of delusion in his final years. The isolation of the island, the constant roar of the sea, the loneliness, it must have warped his mind. These were the ravings of a man unmoored from reality, not literal warnings. The unusual tides were just that. Unusual, a natural anomaly. He tried to convince himself, to logically dismantle the growing unease. But the image of those sketches, the phrase, "the deep song," clung to him like the persistent dampness in the bunker. Dean hadn't meant to keep the journal, not really. After reading those final frantic entries, he'd intended to toss it into the roaring hearth. Let the flames consume the ramblings of a man broken by solitude. Yet it lay on the pine table, a silent challenge. But a prickle, cold and insistent, had begun to burrow beneath his skin. He needed answers, even if only to definitively prove the old man's mind had simply unraveled. The cottage held a sparse collection of books, mostly navigational charts and weather-beaten maritime histories. Dean, a cartographer by trade, had always respected the meticulous detail required for accurate mapping. Now he applied that same methodical approach to his grandfather's fragmented tales. He sought out local histories, obscure pamphlets detailing the island's past. Most were dry accounts of fishing hauls and lighthouse maintenance. But then, tucked away in a brittle, foxed volume titled Legends of the Western Isles, he found it. Whispers of an ancient settlement, not on the island, but beneath the waves. Fishermen's folklore spoke of a sunken city, a place of cyclopean architecture swallowed by a cataclysm long forgotten. The text hinted at a pre-human civilization, its inhabitants said to be of the deep, worshipped by early islanders through peculiar rites involving offerings cast into the churning sea. He reread the entries, his eyes scanning for the word pact. And there it was, stark and undeniable. The pact was made. A promise of sustenance, a tether to the surface. His grandfather hadn't just seen things. He'd believed in a transaction, a horrific bargain. He had dismissed it as a metaphor for the sea's relentless power. But now, a more literal, monstrous interpretation clawed at the edges of his understanding. That night, the dreams began. They weren't the usual chaotic jumble of images. These were vivid, coherent, and utterly terrifying. He couldn't breathe, yet he wasn't drowning. Instead, he floated, a silent observer. Below him, vast, unmoving shapes loomed, impossible geometries that defied logic. He saw glimmers, faint and ethereal, like distant stars in an alien sky. The first time it happened, he attributed it to the unsettling research. The second, to indigestion. He dragged himself out of bed, his limbs heavy, his mind still clouded with the phantom pressure of the deep. As he stumbled towards the small kitchen, his bare foot brushed against something slick on the wooden floorboards near the threshold. He looked down. A patch of luminous green glowed faintly, clinging to the rough-hewn wood. It pulsed with a soft, internal light, like embers from a forgotten fire. It wasn't phosphorescence from the sea. This was too vibrant, too alive. He knelt, his fingers trembling as he touched it. The texture was slimy, cool, and oddly resilient. He'd seen bioluminescent algae on the shore, but never inside the cottage, far from the spray, a good dozen feet from the door. He scrubbed at it with a rag, but it clung stubbornly, leaving a faint, persistent sheen. This wasn't just in his head. This was real. The unsettling presence of the glowing algae, coupled with the increasingly specific details in his grandfather's journal, pushed Dean to search for more tangible evidence. His grandfather's maps, usually precise and functional, had a curious anomaly. A series of faint, almost erased pencil marks that converged on a specific point on the island's rugged eastern flank. The air grew heavier, the vegetation thicker, until he pushed through a final curtain of thorny gorse and found it. A low, moss-covered mound, barely discernible from the surrounding earth. A rusted metal hatch, almost completely swallowed by encroaching roots, was barely visible. An underground bunker. Not a natural cave, but something constructed, deliberately hidden. He wrestled with the hatch, the rusted hinges groaning in protest. With a final, agonizing screech, it gave way, revealing a narrow, descending shaft of rough-hewn stone. The walls were slick with condensation, and here, in the gloom, the bioluminescent algae wasn't just a patch. It was a sprawling, shimmering tapestry, clinging to every surface, pulsing with a pale, unearthly light that seemed to breathe. He could hear his own ragged breathing, the frantic beat of his heart against his ribs. The beam of his lantern danced, revealing crude carvings on the bunker walls, half obscured by generations of damp and growth. They were not human figures. They were sinuous, impossibly long forms, tentacled and scaled, writhing in patterns that hurt his eyes to trace. This wasn't some isolated delusion. The isolation of the island was no longer a balm. It was a trap, and something vast and ancient was stirring, awakened, and drawing closer. He was no longer trying to prove his grandfather wrong. He was trying to understand the thing that had consumed him, and he was beginning to fear it would consume him too. The words of his grandfather, scrawled and frantic, had sunk into Dean's bones, displacing the marrow with a cold dread. This wasn't a family history of eccentricities. It was a lineage of terrible knowledge, an inheritance of things that should have remained submerged. The isolation he had craved now felt like a tightening noose. The island a stage for something vast and ancient, stirring and drawing perilously close. He found himself pacing the cottage, each floorboard creak a fresh jolt. The air itself seemed thicker, laden with an unseen pressure. It began subtly, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated not in his ears, but in the hollows of his chest. A deep, persistent hum like a distant, immense engine turning. He checked the old generator, the wiring, anything that could produce such a sound, but found nothing. Then came the movement. A stack of his meticulously organized maps, laid out on the heavy oak table, shifted, not a slide, but a subtle, almost imperceptible rearrangement, as if an invisible hand had nudged them. He stared, breath held, but they remained still. Later, a small porcelain teacup left on the mantelpiece tumbled to the hearth, shattering with a sharp crack that echoed the tremor in his own hand. Dean told himself it was the house settling, the old wood contracting, the sea air playing tricks. But the hum intensified, a deeper note joining the chorus, a sound that felt less mechanical and more organic. He walked past the large, tarnished mirror in the hallway, catching his reflection. For a split second, his face was not his own. He spun, his heart lurching, but the reflection in the glass was perfectly normal, his own anxious face staring back, pale and drawn. He reached out, touching the cool, smooth surface, trying to rationalize the momentary distortion, but a shiver traced its way down his spine. It was a trick of light, he insisted, a tired mind conjuring phantoms. But the hum in his chest pulsed, insistent. The cottage, once a refuge, was becoming a cage. Dean sought distraction, plunging back into his grandfather's journals, hoping to find a pattern, a clue, anything to make sense of the encroaching unease. He found himself drawn to the cryptic entries, the strange symbols etched into the margins of the later pages, crude pictograms that resembled intertwining tentacles or swirling currents. These weren't mere doodles. They were deliberate, repeated markings, almost like a desperate form of calligraphy. His search led him to a small, heavy wooden chest tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the grandfather's study. Beside it, a cluster of small, iridescent shells, meticulously arranged, and a piece of petrified wood, strangely smooth on one side, rough and barnacle-like on the other. He recognized the smell emanating from the chest. A deep, briny scent, but with an underlying sweetness, cloying and unsettling, like decay and something sickly floral. It made the air feel thick, almost viscous. This wasn't just observation. This was an active engagement. The grandfather hadn't merely recorded, he had interacted. Vials of blood. Human blood, he realized with a sickening jolt, and a single polished stone from the deepest tide pool. His grandfather hadn't just been afraid, he had been trying to appease. Or perhaps, to bargain. The hum grew louder, a deep, guttural vibration that seemed to emanate from beneath the very foundations of the island. It pulled at him, a low siren call that resonated with the fear blossoming in his chest. It indicated a hidden entrance. Driven by a desperate need for answers, or perhaps by the hum itself, Dean grabbed a lantern and headed out into the deepening twilight. The air was heavy, mist clinging to the rocks like damp shrouds. He found the gully, narrow and choked with sea spray-soaked ferns. It was the entrance to an underground bunker. He stepped inside, the lantern beam cutting a shaky path through the gloom. Water dripped from the ceiling, echoing in the confined space. The hum here was deafening, vibrating through the rock, through his very bones, a resonant bass note that made his teeth ache. The bunker was small, circular, its walls rough-hewn stone. In the center, a shallow stone basin was filled with murky water, and around it, an array of the same strange shells and petrified wood he'd found in the chest, carefully arranged. The hum intensified, distorting, becoming less a sound and more a pressure, a presence. The murky water in the basin rippled, though nothing had touched it. Then, from the corners of his vision, he saw it. It was a towering, indistinct shape, vaguely humanoid, yet impossibly vast, with tendrils that seemed to writhe and stretch towards him. He choked, a gasp caught in his throat, and stumbled backward, dropping the lantern. He heard a sound, a wet, sucking inhalation, impossibly close. He scrambled, blindly, desperately, hands scraping against the rough stone walls, the hum a roaring torrent in his head. The air grew heavy, like being submerged in thick mud. He didn't look back. He just ran. This wasn't a family history of eccentricities. It was a lineage of terrible knowledge, an inheritance of things that should have remained submerged. He spent the next days hunched over the journal, the smell of brine and old paper clinging to his clothes. The ink was faded in places, smudged in others, as if written with frantic, trembling hands. Dean, a cartographer by trade, found a grim irony in applying his skills to this abyssal map of madness. He cross-referenced dates, deciphered strange symbols that looked like twisted nautical knots, and pieced together fragmented phrases. His grandfather's observations weren't merely passive, they were active, desperate. "The rhythm grows stronger," one entry read, "the handwriting particularly jagged. It pulls at the edges of the mind, a constant hum beneath the tide's roar." The offering. Not a metaphor, he realized with a sickening lurch. His grandfather hadn't just been a lonely man documenting maritime oddities. He had been a guardian, a custodian of a terrifying balance, actively involved in a ritual to keep it dormant. The cryptic references to the binding stones and the veiled passage weren't just folklore. They were instructions. As he delved deeper, the lighthouse around him began to feel less like a shelter and more like a conduit. The constant thrum of the sea outside shifted, subtly at first, then with an insistent, deep resonance that seemed to bypass his ears and vibrate directly in his skull. It wasn't a sound he could isolate, but a pressure, like deep water pressing in from all sides. He started referring to it in his thoughts as the deep song. The deep song began to weave itself into the fabric of his perceptions. The salt spray that misted the windows seemed to carry a strange metallic tang, like old blood mixed with brine. He'd stare at a familiar object, a teacup, a compass, and for a disorienting moment, its form would seem to ripple, its edges blur, as if it were melting into the air. It implied something hidden, something fundamental to the ritual. He stood, his knees protesting, and walked the familiar circuit of the lighthouse's base level, his gaze now sharpened by an awful certainty. He ran his fingers along the cold stone, searching for any anomaly. The floorboards, worn smooth by generations of footsteps, seemed solid. He knelt, pushing aside a collection of dusty old lanterns, and ran his hand along the floor. There. A faint tremor beneath his palm, a minute given the wood. It was expertly disguised, a section of the floor that lifted. He fumbled for a purchase, found a small, almost invisible metal ring embedded flush with the wood. With a grunt of effort, he pulled. The wood creaked, protested, then gave way with a low groan, revealing a gaping black square. It wasn't just a cellar. This was too deep, too deliberately concealed. He reached for a lantern, his hand trembling, and ignited the wick. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the oxygen had long been consumed by whatever lay below. He had found it, the veiled passage, his grandfather's hidden chamber. The journal's map had led him here, to this place, this underground bunker. The shaft ended in a small, circular chamber. The walls were not just stone. They were carved with the same twisted knot-like symbols he'd seen in the journal, repeated endlessly. A litany of binding. Dean stood paralyzed, the lantern light shaking in his hand. The deep song here was deafening, a roar without sound, a pressure that threatened to crack his skull. He was not just an heir to the lighthouse. He was an heir to the ritual. Dean's breath hitched. The cryptic references. They weren't ramblings. They were instructions. He had to see it. He ran. Back through the cottage, the pages of the journal flapping uselessly on the table, the generator shed. That was the only place. Inside, the air thrummed with the low, guttural growl of the machine. Dean ignored it, his eyes scanning the cramped space. He remembered the loose floorboard, the one his grandfather had always warned him about as a child. "Watch your step, Dean. Wouldn't want you falling into the dark." a childhood warning that now echoed with chilling significance. He found it easily enough, the wood slightly warped, the nails rusted. He pried it up with the rusty end of a crowbar he found propped against the wall. Beneath it was a narrow, dirt-lined hole, barely wide enough to squeeze through. Something ancient and indefinably wrong, like ozone mixed with decay. Dean hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to run as far from the island as he could. But the image of the drawings in the journal flashed in his mind. The swirling vortex, the monstrous shapes, the chilling certainty that whatever it was coming. He lowered himself into the hole, the rough earth scraping against his skin. It was a tight fit, claustrophobic. He groped for purchase, his boots finding slick, uneven steps carved into the earth. The steps spiraled down, deeper and deeper. The generator's drone faded above him, replaced by a faint, rhythmic pulsing like a heartbeat. A monstrous, sluggish heartbeat. Finally, his feet landed on solid ground. The air was thick, heavy, almost viscous. He fumbled for his lighter, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped it. The flame flickered to life, casting a weak yellow glow. The chamber was made of rough-hewn stone, the walls slick with moisture. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, and upon it, something pulsed. It was difficult to describe. A sphere of obsidian-like material, veined with glowing crimson lines. It wasn't solid, not entirely. It seemed to writhe, to breathe, the crimson lines pulsing in time with the monstrous heartbeat he had heard on the way down. As Dean stared, mesmerized, the crimson lines intensified. The pulsing grew stronger. The air crackled with energy. He felt a pressure building in his head, a sense of intrusion. Suddenly the sphere flared, bathing the chamber in an unearthly red light. Images flooded Dean's mind, not his own images, but visions of what? Of a world beneath the waves, a city of cyclopean structures built from black volcanic rock. Of the island, consumed, submerged, becoming part of that alien landscape. He saw himself, too. Or rather, he saw what it intended for him. A vessel. An empty shell, his mind scoured clean, his body a conduit for its will. He would be a part of the island's transformation, a living sacrifice to usher in its reign. The visions intensified, becoming more vivid, more horrifying. He saw faces in the swirling crimson light. The fisherman, the shopkeeper, all the islanders, their eyes vacant, their bodies moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. Puppets. They were becoming puppets. Dean stumbled back, his hands flying to his head. The pressure was unbearable. He felt like his skull was about to crack open. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the visions, but they were inside him now, burned into his consciousness. He screamed. A raw, animalistic sound that echoed in the confined space. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The crimson light faded. The pulsing subsided. The sphere returned to its dull, obsidian state. Dean gasped for breath, his body trembling uncontrollably. He collapsed against the damp stone wall, his mind reeling. He was drenched in sweat, his clothes clinging to his skin. He understood the nature of the entity, its cosmic hunger, its relentless desire to consume. And he knew that it wasn't just the island that was in danger. It was everything. He was just one man, alone on a remote island, facing an ancient, malevolent force from the depths of the ocean. He was terrified. A spark of defiance. He wouldn't let it win. He wouldn't let it consume him, or the island, or anyone else. He would fight. The cold air in the cottage's study, once merely a chill, now seemed to press in on Dean, thick and viscous. The words from his grandfather's journal. The offering still resonated in his mind, each syllable a hammer blow against his fragile sense of reality. He wasn't just reading a record of obsession. He was deciphering a confession, an active participant's account of a terrifying, ongoing pact. His grandfather hadn't been a lonely man. He'd been a custodian, a guardian of a monstrous secret. A faint, rhythmic thrumming began. It wasn't in the walls or the floorboards. It was deeper, resonating beneath the foundations of the cottage, vibrating through the very bedrock of the island. Then, inexplicably, it shifted. A low pulse that seemed to originate not from the ground, but from inside Dean's own skull. A subtle, insistent pressure behind his eyes. He squeezed them shut, trying to dislodge the sensation, but it clung, a parasite burrowing into his thoughts. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at his resolve. He wasn't alone. It wasn't just beneath the waves anymore, a distant, encroaching dread. It was here, pressing against the thin membrane of his sanity, testing the boundaries of his mind. He flinched, twisting his head as if to shake off an invisible assailant. He could almost feel it. A vast, unseen presence unfurling itself, stretching tendrils of thought and influence towards him. It was a hunger, an ancient, fathomless craving that resonated with the profound emptiness left by his own grief. His breath hitched, ragged and shallow. It was trying to break through. It was trying to possess him. There had to be more. He flipped through the brittle pages, his fingers trembling, desperate for a clue, a last resort. His grandfather had chronicled its stirrings, its demands, its nature. Surely he had also documented a defense, a method of containment beyond these horrifying offerings. His eyes scanned page after page, a blur of meticulous script and strange angular symbols. They spoke of the final seal, the deepest chamber, and cryptic references to the binding. A crude, unsettling diagram followed, depicting a structure half buried beneath the earth, its entrance obscured by dense, gnarled roots. Below it, a single stark phrase: the bastion, beneath the old lookout. Dean knew the place. A crumbling stone structure, half swallowed by the moor, a relic from the island's defensive past. But he'd never seen an entrance, only a collapsed ruin. The deepest chamber. It had to be an underground bunker, hidden, forgotten. The wind outside howled, a banshee wail that seemed to carry the very voice of the entity. The fog, thicker than he had ever seen it, swallowed the cottage whole, a swirling, damp shroud that pressed against his skin like a living thing. He moved with a speed born of desperation, his gaze fixed on the faint, barely discernible path towards the old lookout. The thrumming in his head reached a crescendo, a dizzying cacophony that threatened to shatter his focus. He found the lookout, its stones slick with moisture, its collapsed roof a jagged silhouette against the featureless gray. Scrambling over fallen masonry, he spotted it, a fissure in the earth, half concealed by thorny gorse bushes and a cluster of lichen-covered boulders. He shone his lantern down. The air that billowed up was rank, a potent blend of whetstone, iron, and something profoundly old, like the breath of the forgotten past itself. He tied the rope to a sturdy root, tested its strength, and began his descent. The shaft was tight, the rough-hewn walls scraping against his clothes. He reached the bottom, landing on a floor of packed earth. The underground bunker stretched before him, a low-ceilinged cavern of rough-hewn stone. Water dripped from unseen cracks, echoing loudly in the suffocating quiet. These weren't just warnings. They were prayers, pleas, and desperate attempts at binding. He pulled out the journal again, holding it close to the lantern. His grandfather's hurried entries detailed the bunker, its purpose as a final barrier, and the ritual needed to activate the true seal. His eyes darted across the page, tracing the faded words until he found it. The deepest bond severed, the self rendered anew, The heart laid bare, not in death, but in absolute renunciation. Absolute renunciation. Not a sacrifice of life, but of self. His hands trembled, the journal shaking in his grasp. The entity had sought to possess him, to draw him into its domain. And now, he found a way to stop it, but it demanded something far more insidious, far more terrifying than a mere death. The choice was clear, yet agonizing. The journal's final entry had been a cold, stark pronouncement. Absolute renunciation. Dean had felt a tremor deep in his bones, not just from the chill seeping through the cottage walls, but from the chilling implication of those words. He clutched the weathered leather, its pages now feeling less like a historical record and more like a grim instruction manual for his own unraveling. Not with wind, not with gulls, but with a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the air itself. The sky, once a bruised gray, had curdled into a swirling vortex of unnatural green and black, a hue that pressed down with tangible weight. Rain lashed against the windows, not in sheets, but in solid, stinging ropes, each drop feeling like a tiny pebble flung by an unseen hand. The lighthouse beam, usually a comforting sweep across the churning waters, now seemed to struggle, its light fractured and diffused by the sheer density of the atmospheric chaos. He could feel it, a vast, malevolent pressure building, pushing in on the island, on his mind. It was like being submerged in a crushing depth, the air thinning, the world distorting. The trees outside the cottage, ancient and gnarled, no longer swayed in the gale. They writhed, their branches twisting into grotesque, skeletal arms that clawed at the roiling sky. He thought he saw in the brief, flickering illumination of a lightning strike, the very earth around the cottage begin to heave, wet soil bubbling and shifting as if something vast and unseen stirred beneath. This was it, then. The entity was gathering its forces, no longer content to merely whisper in his dreams. It was manifesting, bending reality to its will, asserting its ancient claim. He would not yield. He could not yield. He gathered the few things he needed: the journal, a coil of thick rope, a small rusted lantern he'd found in the cottage's cellar, and a crude, heavy iron bar. The floorboards groaned beneath his boots, not from his weight, but from the island's own tortured convulsions. Pushing open the heavy oak door, Dean stepped out into the maelstrom. The wind tore at his clothes, trying to rip the breath from his lungs. His gaze was fixed on the distant, low-lying hill where his grandfather had spoken of a hidden place. The underground bunker. The journey was a battle. Every step was a fight against the wind, against the slick, shifting earth. He passed the skeletal remains of what had once been a fishing shack, now reduced to splintered timbers that groaned like tormented beasts. The very landscape seemed to be dissolving, the familiar contours of the island blurring into a chaotic nightmare. Finally, he reached the overgrown mound, half hidden by a tangle of storm-lashed gorse. With a final desperate heave, the lock snapped, and the heavy metal door creaked open, revealing a gaping black maw. The air inside was still, heavy, and smelled of damp earth and stale metal. It was a reprieve, however brief, from the howling chaos outside. He descended into the underground bunker, the iron bar clanging against the steps. It was a small, circular chamber, built for survival, for waiting out the end of the world. And in a way, he realized, that's exactly what he was doing. Spreading the journal open on a flat stone slab, Dean leaned close, the lantern's light flickering over the faded ink. The final pages were dense, filled with symbols and archaic script that had seemed impenetrable before. The counter-ritual. It wasn't about banishment, not entirely. It was about severing the connection, about rejecting the invitation that the entity extended. An invitation to a different kind of existence, an existence without self, without memory, without the anchor of the known world. It spoke of a focal point, a specific memory, a core emotional truth that the entity had been subtly targeting, trying to corrupt, to twist into an access point. The journal described a specific sequence of thoughts, a mental journey through the labyrinth of his own past, culminating in a deliberate act of mental excision. It was a form of self-surgery, not of flesh, but of consciousness. The cost was immense. He might emerge changed, diminished, or even fundamentally broken. But the alternative? He glanced towards the heavy metal door, hearing the distant, muffled shriek of the storm, feeling the very ground beneath the bunker tremble. His hands, still trembling, traced the symbols on the page. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the air in the bunker thick with the scent of ancient earth. There was no going back. The path was laid out, grim and terrifying. The journal's final entry, absolute renunciation, had burned itself into Dean's mind like a brand. He gripped the worn leather, his knuckles white. There was no going back. The entity, a hungry void beneath the waves, was already pressing against the edges of his sanity. He stepped out into the night, the wind a banshee's shriek against his face, tasting of salt and something else, something metallic and ancient, like blood drawn from the earth's own veins. The fog, thick as a shroud, had deepened, swallowing the cottage whole moments after he'd exited. The beam of the lighthouse, usually a comforting sentinel, now pulsed with an unnatural, feverish glow, cutting through the swirling mist like a surgeon's scalpel. It beckoned, a malevolent eye in the gloom. The path to the lighthouse was a treacherous ascent, the rocks slick with sea spray and an unfamiliar viscous slime that glistened faintly. Each step was a battle against the gale and a growing sense of immense crushing pressure. It felt as if the very air was thickening, becoming dense with unseen mass, pushing against his chest, making each breath a laborious struggle. The island groaned around him, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated up through the soles of his boots, shaking the ground. He could hear it now beneath the wind's howl, a deep, wet slurping sound, as if something gargantuan was stirring just below the surface of the world. The door, usually bolted, hung ajar, revealing a maw of blackness. The air inside was heavy, stagnant, carrying the stench of decaying seaweed and something far fouler, like stagnant marsh gas mixed with primordial rot. The familiar mechanism of the lamp room was not what drew him. It was the faint, rhythmic pulse emanating from below. A hidden panel, cleverly disguised as part of the stone floor in the antechamber below the lamp room, revealed itself after a moment of frantic searching, just as his grandfather's notes had described. The stench intensified, a suffocating wave that threatened to buckle his knees. This was it. The entry to the underground bunker. Carefully, he descended a series of crude, wet-slicked steps carved into the rock. He could feel it now, not just as a concept, but as a physical force, a vibration in his teeth, a tremor in his very bones. It was vast, ancient, and utterly indifferent. The steps opened into a cavernous circular chamber. The bunker. In the center, a perfectly smooth, obsidian-like slab had been placed, surrounded by a ring of crude, jagged stones. This was the altar, the focal point of the pact. And upon it, a shimmering, pulsating vortex had begun to form, twisting the light from his lantern into strange, nauseating patterns. The air around it warped, rippled like heat haze, and sounds stretched and distorted, making his own breath echo as a monstrous roar. The entity was here, not as a creature of flesh and bone, but as an intrusion, a gaping wound in reality. It was a symphony of sensory overload, the taste of brine and ash in his mouth, the unbearable pressure on his eardrums, the sight of impossible geometries unfolding at the periphery of his vision. Dean stumbled towards the altar, his legs heavy, his mind reeling. The journal had spoken of a final binding act, a renunciation not of life, but of identity, to become the ultimate guardian, a living anchor for the seal. As he neared the obsidian slab, the vortex pulsed with greater intensity, pulling at his very being. It showed him visions. His past, his loved one's face, distorted, twisting into something alien and horrifying. It tried to break him, to make him cling to his self, to refuse the sacrifice. He fought through the psychological onslaught, gripping the ancient heavy stone that had been passed down, the key to the ritual. His head throbbed, his vision blurred, and the entire bunker seemed to tilt, threatening to swallow him. But Dean pushed through it, a desperate resolve hardening his gaze. He would not let this thing consume his world, not after all he had lost. With a guttural cry, he pressed the stone against the shimmering vortex. A blinding, searing white light erupted, followed by an agonizing wave of pure, concentrated energy. It wasn't pain he felt, not truly, but a profound, terrifying dissolution. His memories, his very sense of self began to unravel, tearing away from him like threads from a loom. He was being unmade. The bunker roared, the stone walls cracking, water pouring in from new fissures. The vortex shrieked, a sound that was not sound, but a rending of existence itself. Dean felt his love, his sorrow, his anger, all the facets of his being stripped away, absorbed into the binding magic. The ultimate sacrifice was not death, but the extinction of who he was. He pulled the oilskins tighter, the damp fabric clinging to him. The air tasted of salt and something else, something ancient and acrid, like ozone after a lightning strike, but deeper, fouler. The lighthouse loomed, a skeletal finger against the churning sky. The wind howled, a mournful dirge that seemed to emanate from the sea itself. He stumbled across the slick, seaweed-strewn rocks, the lantern swinging wildly in his hand, casting grotesque, dancing shadows. The beam caught on something ahead. The heavy, rusted iron door of the underground bunker, half hidden in the cliff face. Finally, with a groan of protesting hinges, it swung inward, revealing a narrow, descending staircase. The air inside the underground bunker was thick, stagnant. The stench was overpowering. Mildew, brine, and something else. Something organic and decaying. The space was small, cramped. Shelves lined the walls, laden with strange devices. Copper coils, glass jars filled with murky liquids, intricately carved stones. In the center of the room, a massive iron-bound chest sat on a raised platform. This was it. But at what cost? He remembered his grandfather's words, echoing in his mind. "The price is high, Dean. Are you willing to pay it?" He approached the chest, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a single object. A silver tuning fork. It was intricately engraved with symbols he recognized from the journal, symbols of binding, of control. As he did, a voice echoed in his mind, not his own, but ancient, vast, and infinitely sorrowful. "You cannot stop it. It is inevitable." He ignored the voice. He found the resonant stone, a large quartz crystal mounted on a tripod, in the corner of the underground bunker. He knew what he had to do. He had to strike the tuning fork and hold it to the stone, to amplify the counter-frequency, to sever the connection between the island and it. He took a deep breath, raised the tuning fork, and struck it against the edge of the resonant stone. A pure, clear tone rang out, filling the underground bunker. The sound vibrated through him, resonating deep within his bones. The air crackled with energy. The voice returned, stronger now, laced with anger. "Fool, you cannot comprehend the power you trifle with." He held the tuning fork steady, his hand trembling. The crystal began to glow with an intense white light. He focused on the image of his wife, Sarah, on the memory of her laughter, of her smile. The light from the crystal intensified, blindingly bright. The tuning fork vibrated violently in his hand. The light faded. The tuning fork went still. The pressure in his head vanished. He stood there, gasping for breath, his body trembling. The underground bunker was silent, still. The only sound was the wind howling outside. He had done it. He had severed the connection. But the silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, pregnant with a sense of loss, of emptiness. He looked down at the tuning fork in his hand. It was no longer silver. It was dull, tarnished, lifeless. He had paid the price. He had sacrificed something. But what? He didn't know. He couldn't remember. He stumbled out of the underground bunker into the howling wind. The deep song was gone. But something else was gone too. Something within him. He was alone. Utterly, irrevocably alone. He didn't know if he could leave the island. He didn't know if he even wanted to. He was its keeper, its guardian, forever bound to its desolate shores. He closed his eyes and listened to the wind. It no longer sounded like a dirge.